Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is one in a short series of videos that I'm doing about the design of resource systems in video games, which is part of a larger set of videos all about games design topics. And in this one, I'm going to produce some design thoughts, so some considerations that you might want to think about as a designer, specifically when looking at resources of various kinds. Of course, currencies and money are one type of resource, but there's all sorts of types of resource that you can have in games. If you're confused by this term, see the earlier videos in this series. Okay, so I'm going to present these as 10 ideas, and I'm going to try and go through them fairly quickly because otherwise it might drag on. So the first one is sources and sinks. So I did talk about sources and sinks in the previous video in this series in some detail. um, but as a designer, when you have a resource mechanic, it is always worth being aware of what your sources and your sinks are for that resource, how they appear, how the player gets them, and how they disappear again. And potentially, when it comes to thoughts of balance, these are important concepts. So being deliberate about your sources and sinks is good. The second one is target currencies. So it's possible to have more than one currency in a game. And here's a picture of World of Warcraft. And World of Warcraft in the past, I don't know if it still does, has cooking tokens. And cooking tokens are like another currency within the game, but they're tied into the cooking profession, the cooking system. So there's something you get as a reward for doing cooking, and they allow you to advance in your cooking. So rather than having using the money, which is a generalized currency, this is a targeted currency. And if you want to reward players for doing one particular thing by allowing them to do more of that particular thing, then a targeted currency is one way of doing so. Um, the other extreme is to only have one resource for your game in total. Here's a picture of one of the Rollercoaster Tycoon games. So games like this fairly typically use some kind of in-game currency, money as the single resource. Or, well, I suppose you could argue some other things, maybe staff or resource, but in the main, everything comes off the one resource. And I've seen this in other games where you might think it's unusual. So I haven't got a screenshot because I can't remember exactly which game it was, but there was some extreme sports game. I think it was a snowboarding game that I was playing where you gained money for things and then you could spend that money on skills. So it didn't have a separate skill point system. It used the same currency system. And this is a legitimate tactic, but you need to understand the consequences of this, which is that then players are, if there are other things they can buy, then they're thinking about where they should be spending their money in terms of getting the best return for their gameplay. Right, grinding. Okay, so we've got a picture of EverQuest here. Um, grinding is something that is very controversial in games, or can be. Some players profess to like to grind. A lot of players will complain about grinding in games. Grinding is potentially connected to game addiction as well, so I think there are issues there. Um, but the bottom line for a grind is that sometimes you're in the kind of brainless mood and you feel like doing the grind, but most of the time you want to achieve things and you don't want to be doing the same thing over and over again. And why am I talking this in terms of currencies? Well, currency is one of the places where, resources is one of the places where grinds can come into play. And particularly if you're grinding to get enough money to afford something that you particularly want, or if you're grinding to make something. And materials grinding, I think, is one of the deadliest types of grinding. My hint for materials grinding is to, instead of saying you need 50 pieces of coal to make this thing, is to actually break that down and make them several different resources. Um, and to just do small amounts but larger, but spread more, so that it gives more variety for the player in terms of what they're looking for and managing things. I also think that, and I'll talk about this more when I do a video, hopefully on crafting systems uh, later, is that using intermediates items that you make and then go towards making the final item can be a way of dealing with grinding. Anyway, when you're designing stuff that is around resources, beware of the fact that you may be encouraging grinding, and ask yourself if that is what you want to encourage as a designer, because players are curious things, and some players seem to be their own worst enemies. If there's a way of making the game not fun, then they will try and do so somehow, and grinding is one of those. If there's a way of embracing grinding, then there will be players who will do that, despite the fact that they will then complain about it. It's very strange. Anyway, moving on. Balance. Obviously, this is a thing that needs to be thought about in terms of game resources. Uh, yeah, Monopoly games. There's always this balance in Monopoly, but being bankrupt is a thing that you don't want to happen in a single player game. You need it to be a challenge. So if we're going back to the kind of Rollercoaster Tycoon type games or anything like that, there needs to be enough danger of bankruptcy for it to be a challenge, but it needs to not be impossible. And you might have different difficulty levels to set up within the games. That's just, for a single currency game. For other uh, more complex games with more complex resources, then again there needs to be this sort of balancing potentially. And uh, I guess the two questions here about your resource are: is the resource too plentiful? And if it is, then is wasted, or is your resource too scarce? Is it too hard to get hold of it? In which case, both of those are unbalanced. I love the Grand Theft Auto series of games, but there was one of them in my memory is Grand Theft Auto Vice City, which is going back years and years. Um, there was an issue with the money in that game, in that you just got far too much and there was nothing decent to spend it on. And it's fairly endemic in the Grand Theft Auto games that you gain lots of money and there's not really that much worth spending it on. So it didn't break the game, but it was something that was a bit of a shame. Right, where are we? Sandboxes. So there's the kind of flip side of having balanced currencies and thinking about sources and sinks is uh, the popularity of sandbox modes, where basically you say, "Go on, you can have everything you like. Here you are. It's all for free," and you completely break that challenge element of the game. Yet these things can be popular. So having your balanced currency isn't the be all and end all for your game, and um, all sorts of games starting to have sandbox modes. This is, I believe, PUBG. Um, Vendors, right? Okay, so um, there's some interesting things with vendors in Skyrim, which this is a picture of. One of which is that they have limited money themselves, which is a curious thing. I'll talk more about that when I talk about economies in games. Um, there is this thing, which is that vendors will almost always will sell to the player at a lower, get it the right way around, at a higher price than they will buy from the player. Now, first of all, this mimics the real world in that if you have any kind of uh, shop system where people will buy from the public and then sell back to the public, of course you want to be making a profit. And so there needs to be a gap, a disparity between the two. So that's the real world justification for this. There is also a game justification for this, which is that if you had a game system where you could sell to um, a vendor at the same price that you could buy from the vendor, then then this negates all sorts of inventory systems because effectively you can start using your vendor as your inventory. It depends on your access to the vendors, but as soon as you can store things in the vendor and not lose money in the process, then um, then players will do so, which is, I think, a good reason for making sure that there is a reasonable difference between these two things, so that players aren't just tempted to use it as a hired place to store stuff if they don't want to get rid of it. Of course, vendors buying stuff from players is very useful if you have games, RPGs particularly have vendor trash. Um, and not all games have them, but whatever systems you have, uh, you may be able to sell back things that you previously bought. So that, again, maybe talk about a transport type game where you've set up a rail track and you want to get rid of it. Maybe it's reasonable for the rail track to actually for you to be able to sell it back to the game, as it were, but maybe you don't want to be doing it effectively for free so that the player can just sell it all back and get all their money back because yeah, it doesn't work in terms of balance very well. And exploits. So beware of exploits in currencies and other resources. Um, there's a perception that if as a player you can manage to find a cycle of resources where you gain the resources gain, then this is something that yeah, you're going to be able to exploit and be able to get money out of it. Now, some game systems do that automatically. So farming games, for example, you start with seed and then you wait some time. You might have to do some other things. You harvest and you gain at the end, and that's the whole point of this game is that you gain more seed than you put in, and this is realistic as well. Um, I knew somebody who was playing a Minecraft mod that they'd got from the marketplace, and they found an exploit in it where it was one that involved, I believe it was honey as a currency, and you could buy various things from various vendors with honey. And they found one vendor who would sell you honey for a resource, and another who would um, do the opposite transaction. And in the process of the transaction, you could go to one and exchange your honey for, I can't remember what it was, say seeds. Though. You could exchange your honey for seeds. One honey would buy you 50 seeds, and then you go to another vendor, and the 50 seeds would buy you two honey. And so you gained honey just by going to the vendors and going backwards and forwards. And this person who was playing was delighted by finding this and then spent quite a long time going backwards and forwards, increasing their honey supply. So first of all, it did break things in terms of it broke the challenge in finding and creating honey in the ways that the mod was meant to do so. They suddenly found themselves rich and they could do everything, and everything stopped being a challenge, and so it broke the uh, uh, this mod. And the other thing was that they'd done so at the expense of time that hadn't been interesting because they'd just run backwards and forwards between these two vendors, driving up this honey that they got, and it was effectively a grind, and it took time. So they thought that this was a good thing. In fact, it was a bad thing because it made them grind and it broke the game effectively for them. So beware of exploits and kind of circles like that can make things come out badly. Right. Fairness. So especially when it's currencies and money, but in all sorts of places, players do understand that the world that you've created is a fantasy world, whether it's a fantasy setting or not, and they do understand that games are not real. But they do still get upset if they think that they've been unfairly treated. If they've been sold something and it wasn't worth what they've been sold, then then they do get upset and they can take against games. And fairness is a very important games design concept, which is that the players need to feel that things have been fair. Now, sometimes if you give them something that's a bargain, they'll feel like they've gained one over the game. That's fine, but if they feel like the game is promising something and not giving them value for money, or if they see items that just seem to be ridiculously overpriced, um, then uh, then they can get upset about this. So it's something that's worth thinking about when you're thinking about resources and transactions. Um, and then finally, feedback, which is it's players need to know what state they're in. They need to know what resources they've got. You need to tell players when they gain resources. You need to tell them when resources have been taken away. And depending on what resources you've got, especially if you've got currency, is worth them being able to find out how much they've got very easily. So being able to manage the resources is quite important. Okay, so that's a bit of a run through of some almost randomized ideas, but they're the design thoughts and concepts surrounding the ideas of resources in games. From here on, for the next few videos in the series, we're going to focus very specifically on currencies and money in games and some comparisons with real life money, some ways that the two bleed into each other. That's it from me for now.